You have never been useful to me, Lucian Rothwell said, his voice as cold and even as the winter rain lashing against the library glass. Constance Fenwick did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She stood before the massive mahogany desk, her hands folded quietly over the worn wool of her gray morning dress, her spine perfectly straight. She did not flinch. She did not protest. She merely looked at the Duke of Rothwell, taking in the exhausted lines bracketing his mouth, the shadows beneath his pale, piercing eyes, and the rigid, unyielding set of his shoulders. It was not pity that held her silent. It was something harder and more respectful. It was the absolute certainty that this man, hollowed out by war and betrayed by everyone he had ever trusted, was blind to the very foundation of his own house. "As you say, Your Grace," Constance replied. Her voice was a soft, steady murmur in the cavernous room, carrying no trace of the devastation that ought to have followed such a dismissal. She offered a brief, perfectly executed curtsy, turned on her heel, and walked out of the library, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her with a definitive, quiet finality. To understand the cruelty of his statement, one had to understand the sheer, overwhelming silence of Silverbeck. The estate was a sprawling, ancient beast of stone and timber, set deep in the rolling countryside near Kingsbrook. For 3 years, ever since Lucian had returned from the continent with a shattered leg and a heart turned to ash, the house had been a tomb. His former steward had embezzled thousands of pounds before fleeing to the Americas. His distant relatives had descended like vultures, picking at the remains of his fortune and his patience. And then there was Harriet Fenwick. Harriet, Constance's aunt and legal guardian, had brought her to Silverbeck under the guise of familial charity. Harriet was a woman of sharp angles and sharper ambitions, a controlling matriarch who monetized her niece's absolute dependence. Constance was 24, unglamorous, and entirely invisible. She possessed no fortune, no striking beauty that would command a ballroom, and no voice that anyone cared to hear. Harriet had installed herself as the reigning hostess of Silverbeck, playing the benevolent cousin to the grieving Duke, while quietly siphoning funds, accepting bribes from local merchants, and consolidating her own power. But Harriet did not run Silverbeck. Constance did. From the moment the household woke at 5 in the morning until the last candle was snuffed past midnight, Constance was the invisible engine keeping the great estate from collapsing into absolute ruin. She did not do it for praise, for there was none to be had. She did it because competence was the only armor she possessed. She did it because a house in pain called to the quietest parts of her soul. Every morning, long before the sun crested the frost-bitten hills of Kingsbrook, Constance sat in the freezing pantry with Joan, the gruff, fiercely loyal cook. They would go over the menus, stretching a severely diminished budget to feed 50 souls. Constance knew precisely how many sacks of flour remained in the cellar, down to the last pound. She knew that the coal merchant from Merivale was cheating them, and she had quietly renegotiated the contract, saving the estate £42 and 6 shillings a quarter. She knew that Zeke, the aging head gardener, suffered from rheumatism, and so she secretly carried the heavy buckets of lye and ash for the winter soil herself, her hands blistered and raw, hidden beneath cheap cotton gloves. She mended the ancient tearing tapestries in the drawing room, stitch by microscopic stitch, her needle weaving through the fading threads of history so that Harriet could boast of the room's elegance to her society friends. She drafted the responses to the Duke's endless legal correspondence, mimicking the former steward's hand perfectly, leaving the neat stacks of paper on Lucian's desk for his signature. Lucian signed them without reading, assuming the estate's lawyers were handling the affairs. He did not know that a woman who had never been taught the law was unraveling the corrupt tangle of his tenant leases, saving his farmers from ruin and his estate from bankruptcy. She was a ghost in her own life, and ghosts, Constance knew, were not permitted to demand recognition. The confrontation in the library had been entirely orchestrated by Harriet. A miniature portrait of Lucian's late mother, framed in heavy gold and seed pearls, had gone missing from the morning room. It was a calculated theft. Harriet had long recognized that Constance's silent, relentless efficiency was a threat. If the Duke ever woke from his numb, grief-stricken stupor and truly looked, at how his house was surviving, Harriet's own thefts would be exposed. Harriet needed Constance removed, or at the very least, entirely discredited. And so, the miniature was found tucked beneath the thin mattress in Constance's freezing attic room. When Harriet had dragged her before the Duke, presenting the stolen object with theatrical tears and breathless apologies for her niece's wretched, deceitful nature, Constance had not defended herself. She knew the mechanics of power. She knew that Lucian, exhausted and deeply cynical, would look at the evidence, the gold in her room, the poverty of her clothes, the apparent motive, and draw the logical conclusion. He prized evidence over emotion. He despised theatrics. If she had wept, if she had begged, it would have only disgusted him further. So she had stood in silence, as Harriet spun a web of honeyed, reasonable-sounding cruelty. "She has always been troubled, Your Grace," Harriet had sighed, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I took her in when she had nothing. I clothed her, I fed her, and this is how she repays my charity. She is a burden, a useless, grasping girl who contributes nothing to this house but sorrow. You must send her away, or at the very least, banish her to the scullery, where she can do no more harm." Lucian had sat behind his desk, the dark wood gleaming in the dim light. He had looked at Constance, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in the 6 months she had lived under his roof. He saw a plain woman in a mended dress, her dark hair pulled back severely, her gray eyes as unreadable as slate. He saw no guilt, but he saw no innocence either. He saw only a terrifying, absolute stillness. "Is this true?" he had asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Did you take it?" "No, Your Grace," Constance had said. Just that. No elaboration, no counter-accusation against her aunt, because she had no proof, and proof was the only currency that mattered. Lucian had stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. He hated the noise of Harriet's weeping. He hated the endless, grinding machinery of human greed. He wanted nothing more than to be left alone in the dark. "You have never been useful to me," Lucian had said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. "If you are now a thief, as well as a burden, you leave me no choice. You will remain in your room until I decide what is to be done with you." And Constance had left. Now, sitting on the edge of her narrow, lumpy bed, the freezing air of the unheated attic biting through her thin shawl, Constance looked at her hands. They were rough, scarred by needles and caustic soap, the nails filed short. They were the hands of a worker, not a lady. She thought of the ledgers hidden beneath the loose floorboard under her washstand. She thought of the 10-year crop rotation plan she had drafted for the eastern tenant farms, charting the soil recovery that would yield a massive wheat harvest next autumn. And she thought of the dented silver cup in the kitchens, the one she drank her watered-down tea from every morning, while Joan complained about the butchers. She did not feel despair. She felt a cold, crystalline clarity. If she was banished, the estate would fall. Harriet would bleed it dry within a year. The tenants would be evicted. Joan would be dismissed for her sharp tongue without Constance there to run interference. Zeke would be turned out to starve. Silverbeck would die. Constance stood up. She walked to the small, frost-rimmed window and looked out over the sprawling, snow-dusted grounds. She had spent her entire life enduring. She had endured her parents' death, the loss of Quince Hill, her childhood home, and Harriet's endless, grinding subjugation. She had believed that if she just worked hard enough, if she made herself indispensable enough, she would eventually be safe. She had been wrong. Invisibility was not safety. It was merely a delayed execution. If Lucian Rothwell wanted to believe she was useless, he was about to experience exactly what uselessness looked like. For the first time in 6 months, Constance did not go down to the kitchens at 5 in the morning. She stayed in her room. The collapse of Silverbeck did not happen all at once. It happened by degrees, a slow, agonizing unraveling of 1,000 invisible threads. On the first morning, the fires in the main drawing rooms were not lit by 6. The footmen, lacking Constance's quiet, commanding presence to rouse them from their quarters, overslept. When Lucian limped down the grand staircase at 7, seeking the solitary warmth of the morning room, he found it freezing, the hearth dark and smelling of old ash. On the second day, the post arrived, but there was no neat stack of sorted correspondence on his desk. Instead, a massive, chaotic pile of letters, bills, and legal threats was dumped unceremoniously onto his blotter by a nervous footman. Lucian spent 4 hours trying to make sense of a dispute over a grain shipment, searching for the brilliant, concise summary notes that usually accompanied such problems. They were nowhere to be found. By the third day, the meals had deteriorated into chaos. Harriet, attempting to direct the kitchens, had ordered a lavish 8-course dinner for herself and Georgiana Beaumont, a polished, venomous social rival who had arrived from Dunsmuir for a prolonged visit. Georgiana was a woman whose weapons were gossip and reputation, a creature of silk and malice who had her sights set on the Duke's title. Harriet championed the match, knowing Georgiana would let her maintain control of the household. But Joan the cook flatly refused to take orders from Harriet. Without Constance to translate the budget and soothe the cook's temper, Joan threw a carving knife at a scullery maid, burned the roast, and locked herself in the pantry. Dinner was served 3 hours late, consisting of cold mutton and unseasoned potatoes. Georgiana had smiled her honeyed, reasonable smile and murmured, "Poor Harriet. It must be so difficult to manage a house with such inadequate staff." Lucian sat at the head of the table, silent, his jaw clenched. He ate the cold mutton without tasting it. He looked at Harriet, who was flushed and stammering excuses. He looked at Georgiana, who was watching him with predatory calculation. And for the first time, he noticed a glaring, hollow absence in the room. He realized he did not know who usually managed the dinners. He did not know who usually sorted his mail. He did not know who usually ensured the fires were lit. He had assumed it was Harriet. Harriet had always claimed it was Harriet. But Harriet was currently failing to manage a single meal. That night, unable to sleep, Lucian walked the dark corridors of his home. His leg ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, a phantom pain from a war that had taken everything from him. He carried a single candle, its weak yellow light casting long, trembling shadows against the ancient stone. He found himself walking toward the servants' wing, a place he had not visited since he was a child. He pushed open the heavy baize door that separated the family's quarters from the working heart of the house. It was late, past 2 in the morning. The kitchens should have been empty. but there was a light burning in the small estate office just off the pantry. Lucian moved silently, his cane making no sound on the worn flagstones. He stopped in the doorway. Constance was sitting at a small, scarred wooden table. She was wearing her gray dress, a thick wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the biting draft. A single, cheap tallow candle flickered beside her. She was bent over a massive, leather-bound ledger, a quill flying rapidly across the parchment. She was supposed to be confined to her room. Lucian watched her. He watched the precise, mathematical efficiency of her movements. He watched the way she paused, checked a stack of crumpled receipts, and then made a decisive entry. He watched the absolute, unbroken concentration on her face. She did not look like a thief. She looked like a general commanding a battlefield. "What are you doing?" Lucian asked. His voice shattered the silence. Constance froze. She did not gasp, nor did she drop her quill. She carefully placed the pen back into the inkstand, blotted the page with a steady hand, and then turned in her chair to face him. She did not stand. "I am balancing the coal accounts, Your Grace. If they are not settled by tomorrow morning, the merchant from Maryvale will cut off our supply. The house will freeze by Tuesday." Lucian stepped into the room. "You are confined to your quarters." "I am in my quarters during the day," Constance said, her voice perfectly even. "The estate does not cease to exist simply because I am confined. The accounts must be balanced." "Harriet manages the accounts," Lucian said, though even as the words left his mouth, they tasted false. Constance looked at him. It was a long, devastating look. It held no anger, no resentment, only a bone-deep weariness. "Does she, Your Grace? Ask her the price of a ton of anthracite. Ask her the name of your head carter. Ask her why the Eastern tenant farms yielded a 20% higher profit this quarter than any quarter in the last 5 years." Lucian stared at her. He thought of the neatly drafted summaries on his desk. He thought of the sudden, miraculous recovery of his estate's finances over the last 6 months. "You wrote the summaries," he said softly. It was not a question. "I did," Constance said. "You renegotiated the tenant leases." "I did." "Why?" Lucian demanded, stepping closer, his imposing frame looming over the small table. "Why would you do this in secret? Why would you allow Harriet to take the credit?" "Because no one would have believed me if I claimed the work as my own," Constance said plainly. "I am a penniless dependent. I have no standing, no education in estate management, and no voice. If I had presented those ledgers to you, you would have dismissed them as a woman's interference. Harriet allowed me to do the work because it enriched her, and she presented the results to you as her own brilliance. It was the only way to save the estate." Lucian looked down at the ledger on the table. The handwriting was identical to the flawless script that had organized his life for half a year. "And the miniature?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. Constance met his eyes. She did not blink. "I did not take it. I have never stolen a single farthing from this house. Every penny I have saved, I have poured back into the soil, into the roof, into the winter stores. If I were a thief, Your Grace, I would have taken the silver and fled months ago. I would not be sitting in a freezing pantry at 2 in the morning, making sure your fires remain lit." Lucian held her gaze. He had interrogated captured spies, faced down corrupt officers, and navigated the treacherous waters of the royal court. He knew when a person was lying. He knew the scent of fear and the desperate, frantic energy of deception. Constance possessed none of it. She sat before him, wrapped in cheap wool, possessing a quiet dignity that dwarfed the grandest duchess he had ever met. "Show me," Lucian said. Constance frowned slightly. "Show you what, Your Grace?" Everything, Lucian commanded, pulling a rough wooden stool from the corner and sitting down across from her, his bad leg stretched out awkwardly beneath the table. Show me exactly what you have been doing. For the next 4 hours, they sat together in the cold, flickering light. Constance opened ledger after ledger. She showed him the discrepancies in the previous steward's accounts, the subtle, hidden thefts that had been bleeding the estate dry. She showed him the inflated bills from Harriet's personal modiste, disguised as household expenses. She showed him the bribes Harriet had accepted from local merchants in exchange for exclusive, overpriced contracts. And she showed him the meticulous, brilliant recovery plan she had designed. She had mapped out a 10-year projection for the estate, balancing crop yields, timber sales, and livestock breeding. It was a masterpiece of economic strategy, drafted by a woman who had taught herself mathematics in the dead of night. As she spoke, Lucian's numbness began to crack. The heavy, suffocating shroud of grief and apathy that had defined his existence for 3 years began to dissolve, replaced by a burning, furious clarity. He had been a fool. He had allowed his own pain to blind him to the rot in his house, and he had allowed this extraordinary woman to bear the weight of his failures. He watched her hands as she turned the pages. They were red with cold, the knuckles raw. He saw a small, faded scar across her thumb. "Who did that to you?" he asked suddenly, interrupting her explanation of the timber yields. Constance paused, looking down at her hand. "It is nothing, Your Grace. A slip of the paring knife. I was helping Joan prepare the winter preserves." "You are a gentleman's daughter," Lucian said, his voice tight. "You should not be peeling apples." "I am a dependent," Constance corrected quietly. "I am whatever I must be to survive." Lucian reached across the table. He did not ask permission. He gently took her scarred hand in his own. His fingers were warm, his grip firm, but incredibly gentle. Constance froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had not been touched with kindness in over a decade. "You will not peel another apple," Lucian said, his thumb brushing lightly over the scar. It was not a request. It was a vow. He released her hand and stood up, leaning heavily on his cane. The sun was just beginning to turn the sky the colour of bruised iron outside the high pantry window. "Leave the ledgers," Lucian said. "Go to your room. Sleep. Do not come down until I send for you." "But the coal accounts." "I will handle the coal accounts," Lucian said, his eyes hard and bright. "I will handle everything." We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The following afternoon, Silverbeck was thrown into a state of chaotic preparation. Lady Dorothea Seven, the formidable, sharp-tongued dowager countess of a neighbouring estate, had arrived entirely unannounced. Lady Dorothea was a woman in her 70s who walked with a silver-tipped cane and possessed a mind like a steel trap. She was Lucian's godmother, and she tolerated no fools. Harriet was in a frenzy, ordering the servants to prepare the grand drawing room, snapping at the footman, and fawning over Georgiana Beaumont, who saw Lady Dorothea's arrival as the perfect opportunity to cement her social standing as the future Duchess of Rothwell. Constance remained in her attic room. She had slept for 6 hours, the deepest, most dreamless sleep she had known in years. When she awoke, she found a small iron stove had been brought into her room, radiating a fierce, wonderful heat. On the small table beside her bed sat a tray with fresh bread, hot tea, and a small, delicate pot of strawberry preserves. Joan had brought it. When Constance asked why, the gruff cook had only sniffed, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "His Grace's orders. Said if I let you starve, he'd have my head. Eat the bread, Miss Constance. You're too thin by half." Constance ate the bread. She drank the tea. She felt a strange, terrifying flutter of hope in her chest, but she ruthlessly crushed it. Hope was dangerous. Lucian had seen the ledgers, yes. He understood her valued the estate, but that did not mean she was safe from Harriet's malice. Harriet still possessed the miniature, and she still held the legal right of guardianship. Downstairs, the storm was gathering. Lucian had spent the morning locked in his study, a massive fire roaring in the hearth. He had summoned Zeke, the head gardener, and questioned him quietly for 20 minutes. He had summoned Joan, who had marched in with her arms crossed, deeply suspicious, and had left 10 minutes later with a grim, satisfied smile on her weathered face. Finally, he had summoned a magistrate from Kingsbrook. At 4 o'clock, the summons came. A footman knocked on Constance's door, his manner entirely deferential. "His Grace requests your presence in the grand drawing room, Miss Fenwick." Constance smoothed the front of her grey dress. She checked that her hair was pinned tightly in place. She lifted her chin, armoured herself in silence, and walked down the long, winding stairs to the main floor. The grand drawing room was a masterpiece of Elizabethan architecture, with soaring ceilings, massive tapestries, and a roaring fire that cast dancing light across the polished floorboards. When Constance entered, the room was a tableau of tension. Lucian stood by the fireplace, leaning heavily on his cane, his face carved from granite. Lady Dorothea sat in a high-backed wing chair, sipping sherry, her sharp black eyes darting around the room with intense amusement. Harriet and Georgiana sat together on a velvet settee, looking utterly confident. On the low table in the centre of the room sat the gold and pearl miniature of Lucian's mother. Beside it sat the massive, leather-bound estate ledger. "Ah, the thief arrives," Georgiana murmured, loud enough for the room to hear. She took a delicate sip of her tea. "Really, Your Grace, I do not understand why you tolerate her presence in the main rooms. It sets a terrible example for the staff." "Silence," Lucian said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The single word cracked through the room like a whip. Georgiana snapped her mouth shut, her pale cheeks flushing an ugly, mottled red. Lucian turned his gaze to Harriet. "Mrs. Fenwick, you claim that you found this miniature beneath Miss Fenwick's mattress yesterday morning." Harriet straightened her spine, adopting a mask of aggrieved sorrow. "I did, Your Grace. It broke my heart to discover it. After all I have done for the girl." "And you manage the household accounts, do you not?" Lucian interrupted smoothly. Harriet blinked, thrown by the sudden shift in topic. Yes, of course. I have carried the burden of this great house for you, Your Grace, knowing how deeply you have suffered." "Excellent," Lucian said. He stepped forward and tapped the heavy leather ledger with the silver tip of his cane. "Then you can explain to me why the price of anthracite coal dropped by 40% in October, and yet the household budget reflects an expenditure of £200 paid to the Merivale merchant." Harriet's face drained of colour. She opened her mouth, closed it, and looked frantically at the ledger. The markets fluctuate, Your Grace. It is a complicated matter." "It is not complicated at all," Lucian said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, quiet register that Constance knew so well. "It is theft. You have been overcharging the estate and pocketing the difference. You have accepted bribes from the butcher, the carter, and the glazier. You have stolen from me, Mrs. Fenwick, systematically and shamelessly." "That is a lie!" Harriet shrieked, dropping her mask of sorrow entirely.
She told you this, didn't she? The wretched girl has poisoned your mind. She is a thief. Look at the miniature.
I am looking at it, Lucian said. He picked up the delicate gold frame. It is a beautiful piece. My mother cherished it. I cherished it. Which is why I found it so strange that it was stolen yesterday.
Thieves are opportunistic, Your Grace,
Georgiana offered, trying to salvage the situation. Indeed, Lucian agreed. He looked directly at Georgiana. But it is very difficult to steal an object that has not been in this house for 3 years. The room went dead silent. Only the crackle of the fire broke the stillness. Harriet stared at the Duke, her mouth hanging slightly open. When I left for the continent, Lucian continued, his voice echoing in the cavernous room, I took this miniature with me. I carried it in my breast pocket. When I was wounded at Waterloo, the casing was shattered. I sent it to a jeweler in London to be repaired and held in a secure vault. It was delivered back to me by special courier exactly 3 days ago. He walked slowly toward Harriet, his eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying fury. I placed it in my private desk drawer, a drawer to which only I and the servants who clean my study have the key. Constance has not stepped foot in my study in 6 months. But you, Mrs. Fenwick, were in my study 3 days ago, demanding additional funds for Miss Beaumont's lavish dinners. Harriet was trembling violently. You cannot prove. I don't need to, Lucian said. He gestured to the door. The heavy oak doors opened, and the local magistrate, a stern, gray-haired man named Mr. Tolliver, stepped into the room. Mr. Tolliver has spent the afternoon reviewing the ledgers, Lucian said. He has also taken sworn statements from the coal merchant, the butcher, and my own staff. The evidence of your embezzlement is overwhelming. As for the miniature, planting false evidence to frame an innocent woman for a felony is a serious crime.
You would send me to prison?
Harriet gasped, clutching her chest.
I am your family.
You are a parasite, Lucian said flatly, and you are finished here. You have 1 hour to pack your belongings. A carriage is waiting to take you to a boarding house in Kingsbrook. Your accounts have been frozen. If you ever attempt to contact Constance, or if you ever set foot on my land again, I will have Mr. Tolliver issue a warrant for your arrest, and you will rot in a cell. Harriet burst into hysterical, ugly tears. She looked to Georgiana for support, but Georgiana had already shrunk back against the cushions, her eyes darting toward the door, calculating how quickly she could pack her own trunks and flee the scandal. 1 hour, Lucian repeated. He turned his back on her, a gesture of absolute, dismissive finality. Harriet scrambled to her feet and fled the room, her sobs echoing down the corridor. Georgiana followed swiftly, her head bowed, her ambitions shattered. When the doors closed, leaving only Lucian, Constance, Lady Dorothea, and the magistrate, the silence in the room felt different. It was no longer suffocating. It was clean. It was the silence after a storm. Lady Dorothea chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. She tapped her cane against the floorboards. Well, that was the most entertaining afternoon I have had in a decade. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Lucian, though it took you long enough to wake up and use it. Lucian did not smile. He looked at Constance. She was standing exactly where she had been when she entered the room, her hands folded over her gray dress, her face pale. Mr. Tolliver, Lucian said, without taking his eyes off Constance. If you would excuse us,
Lady Dorothea, I believe your carriage is waiting. It is, the old woman said, rising slowly to her feet. She walked over to Constance and paused. She reached out and, surprisingly, gently, touched Constance's cheek. You have an iron spine, my dear. Do not let him forget it. With a final, approving nod, Lady Dorothea left the room, followed by the magistrate. Lucian and Constance were alone. The fire crackled. Outside, the winter sun was beginning to set, casting long pools of gold across the polished floorboards. Lucian walked toward her. He moved slowly, his limp pronounced after the long, taxing day. He stopped a few feet from her. You did not cry, he said softly. I told you, Your Grace, Constance replied, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering wildly against her ribs. Tears change nothing. You are wrong, Lucian said. Your silence changed everything. Your competence saved my home. Your endurance saved my people. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of parchment. He handed it to her. Constance took it tentatively. She unfolded it. It was a legal document, heavy with seals. It was a transfer of deed. The estate of Quince Hill, her childhood home, which had been sold to cover her father's debts 10 years ago. She looked up, her eyes wide, the iron control she had maintained for so long finally beginning to fracture. How? I sent a rider to London at dawn, Lucian said. I bought it back from the current owner. It is yours, Constance, free and clear. You are no longer a dependent. You are a landowner. You are free to go there, to manage it as brilliantly as you have managed Silverbeck. You are free to live exactly as you choose, owing nothing to anyone. Constance stared at the paper. Her hands were shaking. She had dreamed of Quince Hill every night for 10 years. She had dreamed of the apple orchards, the small, warm house, the safety of walls that belonged to her. She looked at Lucian. His face was entirely open now, the cold mask gone, revealing a man who was deeply, terrifyingly vulnerable. You are giving me my freedom, she whispered. I am returning what was stolen from you, Lucian corrected. By the world, by Harriet, and by my own blindness. He took a step closer. He did not touch her, but his presence was a physical weight, a magnetic pull that made her breath catch. I told you yesterday that you had never been useful to me, Lucian said, his voice thick with emotion. It was the greatest lie I have ever spoken. You have been the only real thing in this house for 6 months. You have been the anchor holding me to the earth while I tried to drown in my own grief. Constance looked up into his eyes. They were no longer pale and dead. They were blazing with a fierce, quiet devotion. I am asking you to stay, Lucian said plainly. Not as a manager, not as a ward, as my equal, as my wife. Constance stopped breathing. The room seemed to spin, the firelight blurring at the edges of her vision. Your Grace. Lucian, he said, the single word a plea. You do not love me, she said, her voice breaking slightly. You respect my ledgers. You respect my competence. But marriage? It is not pity. It is not gratitude, Lucian said fiercely. He closed the distance between them, raising his hands to gently frame her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones.
I sat in that freezing pantry and watched you work, and I felt my heart beat for the first time in 3 years. I watched you face my cruelty without flinching, and I was entirely humbled. I love your mind, Constance. I love your iron spine. I love the way you care for people who have nothing to offer you in return. He leaned down, resting his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes. I am asking, he whispered against her skin. Answer plainly. Will you stay with me? Together? Constance closed her eyes. She felt the warmth of his hands, the solid, grounding reality of his presence. She thought of the long years of invisibility, the cold attics, the silent endurance. And she thought of the fire he had ordered for her room, the bread, the absolute, devastating public defense he had just mounted for her. He had seen her. When no one else would look, he had seen everything. Yes, Constance whispered. Plainly, Lucian murmured, a faint, wondrous smile touching his lips. Yes, Lucian, she said, her voice clear and strong. I will stay. Together. He kissed her then. It was not a desperate, sweeping embrace of a romance novel. It was slow, deliberate, and profoundly deep. It was a seal upon a contract, a recognition of equals, a joining of two people who had survived the dark and finally found the light. When they parted, Constance was smiling. It was a small, quiet thing, but it transformed her face entirely. The coal accounts are still not finished, she pointed out, her eyes shining with sudden, dry amusement. Lucian laughed. It was a rusty, beautiful sound that echoed in the grand room. Then we shall finish them together. But first, you are going to eat a hot meal in the dining room, sitting in the chair at my right hand. And Joan is going to cook it. 2 years later, Silverbeck was unrecognizable. The winter sun shone brightly on the snow-dusted grounds, but inside, the house was entirely alive. The great drawing rooms were filled with the scent of pine and roasting meats. The tapestries had been fully restored, not by Constance's blistered hands, but by professional weavers from London, paid for by the massive profits of the eastern tenant farms. Constance, the Duchess of Rothwell, walked through the halls with a confident, steady step. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, the colour bringing out the striking clarity of her grey eyes. She was not a ghost anymore. The servants bowed and curtsied as she passed, not out of fear, but out of genuine, fierce loyalty. Joan ruled the kitchens like a benevolent tyrant, and Zeke had retired to a comfortable cottage on the grounds, his rheumatism eased by a steady supply of good coal and warm blankets. Harriet had never been seen again. Rumour had it she was living in a small, damp room in London, complaining to anyone who would listen about the terrible ingratitude of nieces. Georgiana Beaumont had married a minor baron with a crumbling estate and a gambling problem, a fitting end for a woman who valued title over substance. Constance entered the estate office. It was no longer a freezing closet off the pantry. It was a bright, expansive room on the first floor, lined with books and bathed in sunlight. Lucian was sitting at the massive oak desk. He looked up as she entered, the severe lines of his face softening instantly into a warm, open smile. The shadows were gone from his eyes. He stood up, leaning slightly on his cane, and walked around the desk to meet her. You are supposed to be resting, he scolded gently, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. I am perfectly well, Lucian, Constance said, leaning into his touch. The midwife said I should remain active. She rested a hand over the slight swell of her stomach, a gesture of quiet, profound joy.
The midwife does not have to argue with you over the timber yields, Lucian chuckled. He kissed her forehead.
What is it? Constance reached into the pocket of her velvet gown and pulled out an object. She placed it carefully on the pristine surface of his desk. It was the dented silver cup, the one she had drunk watered-down tea from in the freezing kitchens years ago. Lucian looked at it, his expression softening into deep, silent understanding. He reached out and picked it up, his large fingers tracing the dents and scratches. I asked Joan to find it, Constance said softly. I wanted it on your desk. Why? Lucian asked, his voice thick. To remind us, Constance said, stepping close and wrapping her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. Of what happens when a house forgets to value the things that hold it together. And of the night you came into the pantry and finally saw me. Lucian set the cup down carefully beside his inkwell. He wrapped his arms around his wife, holding her tight, breathing in the scent of rosemary and clean snow that always clung to her. I will never stop seeing you, Constance, he whispered into her hair. Never. The winter wind howled outside the thick glass windows of Silverbeck, but inside, the fire burned bright, the ledgers were perfectly balanced, and the house was, finally and forever, warm. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.